Well, here's the official story. Um, what they say is that the top part above the point of jet plane impacts drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then crushed itself. Well, this is a complete violation of Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. So it's like this: when you have a Mack truck running into a Volkswagen, who wins? The Mack truck, right? It'll destroy the Volkswagen before it even, it probably takes some minor damage to the bumper and the grill, right? Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure, the top, cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below, which is, by the way, at the top, very light and getting heavier and heavier and heavier as we travel down. These are the actual sizes of the columns in the North Tower until you get down below and they're virtually solid steel. So that's what we mean by the Volkswagen running into the Mack truck. His theory came from Zdeněk Bazan of Chicago Northwestern University in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, a very complex paper that was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. It's called the crush down, crush up theory. It's so obscure that most engineers don't even know how to read it, structural engineers. This is a mathematics wizard, by the way, professor at Chicago Northwestern University. So, but it's been decoded, interestingly. And what was found is that it uses the right formula, but the input data, once again, is falsified in order to get false results from a fraudulent calculation. First of all, it's obfuscation. You can't. It's too difficult to critique, so people just didn't even try until later. There's also, they completely eliminated a complete story of 300 columns in the building. 12-foot high columns. All of a sudden, all of them taken out to account for some of the columns that were damaged by the plane, which were very few in comparison. So this is fraud. He doubled the mass up above. So this is fraud. He decreased the column strength below by 3. So that's fraud. He decreased the velocity loss. That would be due to the law of conservation of momentum, i.e. one floor hitting another and impacting and slowing down. And the column reserve strength was eliminated from the columns below. This is all fraud. And so the results are that there is a 12-to-1, at least more like 24-to-1 rigging of this calculation in favor of a collapse. So that's the kind of science we get when we trust without verifying and asking serious questions those who are put in positions of authority in a cover-up of the crime of the century. The downward momentum would have been arrested in calculations provided by Tony Zamboti. David Chandler measured the downward slope to be nearly free fall, as we'll see. And NIST, Bazant theorized very, very similar results, but fraudulently suggesting that it was a natural collapse. Well, we're going to see something else today. So the effort was by Tony Zamboti and Richard Johns specifically submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers journal. And these two papers were not published. The errors in the original Bazant paper were upheld by the American Society of Civil Engineers. They won't publish these challenges. Very accurate and damning to the official narrative. So American Society of Civil Engineers, Journal of Engineering and Mechanics, said, well, we can't publish it because it's out of scope. How can it be out of scope to highlight the errors in a previously published paper in this journal? So there's a challenge to the ethics committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, which goes on, is ongoing. And so let's actually look. We're told that the upper section drove the rest of the building down to the ground. Well, take a look. Is that what's happening here? Or is something else happening right here in front of our face? Look at the bottom line. Make it easier. The bottom red line is not moving down. The building, the upper section is destroying itself, just like the Volkswagen would upon hitting the Mack truck. And the question is, what is destroying it? That's what we're going to be looking at evidence for today. You can see it here as we start and stop. Just like the firefighters, oops. Play that for you again. Start and stop. Just like the firefighters said, wrapping all the way around the building, smoke clouds. So the theory is that the lightweight trusses sagged due to the fire, the heat on them by the fire, and pulled in these perimeter columns. Well, the perimeter columns are indeed pulling in, as you can see in this looped video. The question is it sagging columns that's pulling those in or something else? Well, we can go to Gene Corley of the FEMA report for a fairly accurate assessment, which completely contradicts the NIST theory because they suggest that the antenna drops first.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
This is very interesting. The core columns let go first because what do we can see that he's accurate. The antenna does drop as we go back to forward 2, 3, back 2, forward 2. That before the perimeter of this building is falling, the antenna falls. Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss, which supports it. What does the hat truss sit on? The hat truss sits primarily on core columns. So the core columns fail, then the hat truss, and then the antenna falls. And so what's causing the perimeter columns to fail? Well, the core columns are pulling on them. Let's take a look in this video. The core columns descend first and they pull on the trusses, which pulls on the perimeter columns. And this video is inaccurate because it fails to take into account a few other things. But anyway, the point is made that it's the core columns causing the damage. Well, what could cause the near simultaneous failure of the core columns? We're going to be looking at that. But first, do you see any pile driver in any of the photos or videos driving the rest of the building down to the ground? No, none of them show it. And yet that's the central thesis of the NIST report. If it were there, you would see that it would have crushed these few remaining core columns that are standing several seconds after the building went down. If they were crushed by the top section of the building, they wouldn't be there. This alone disproves the entire NIST theory and the FEMA theory for that matter. Ask yourself, looking at this now, is this a collapse or does it look more like the volcanic eruption, a series of incredible explosions in the Tongan Sea in March of 2009. Are we even looking at a gravitational collapse? No, we have to look at this whole event with this very specific evidence in mind. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse, not at the bottom of the structure, but at the point of jet plane impacts? Because what we're being treated to here is a magic show, a sleight of hand. We're being told that the plane impacts and fires caused the building at the point of jet plane impacts, but something else has occurred, which we're looking at. Let's look at the South Tower. It begins to fall over. So we have the South Tower falling at 22 degrees off of its axis. We have asymmetrical loading on the structure below, therefore. We have asymmetrical damage from the plane impacts up above. We have asymmetrical damage from the fire. So how in the world do we get complete symmetrical damage all the way around all four sides simultaneously, like the firefighters said, all the way down each of these buildings? You still wondering? Let's zoom in on one of the corners. Take a look. This is 20 stories below what we're told is a natural collapse, and yet the leading corner of this destruction is revealing to us explosions, dozens of them, right in our very face. Explosions which you can see on the lower right corner of this looped video. In addition to explosions, of course, occurring here, which are called squibs, which we'll come back to in a moment. But what we have is a 1,200-foot diameter of destruction around each of these towers. The debris is spread out. We only have a 200-foot tower, and yet the debris is everywhere. Actually, 1,400-foot diameter around each of these towers, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away from the North Tower. So I thought this was a gravitational collapse, and yet we don't see. What we see is the spreading out of the debris well outside the perimeter of each of these towers. Look at Building 7, which was the first webinar in this three-part series, this being part 2, of course. But part 1 was Building 7, a nice, neat implosion, a classic controlled demolition, versus the very explosive event that we know as the Twin Towers.